Hello and welcome to another episode of CollectaThoughts, the show where I collect my thoughts on video games, and today we're going to be talking about SIFU, a fairly highly anticipated action game, at least for its budget, I would say. Once in a while, smaller games like this do get quite a lot of media attention due to their settings or whatever they're going for with their game, and here I definitely think it comes from the gameplay and the way it looks like it would play. Being reminiscent of games like God Hand, close combat, martial art games just have never been too prevalent in the genre, probably due to the higher popularity of, guns and swords, I guess would be a way to put it, and also maybe the difficulties that come with making a much more tactile and close combat type of game. And so how does SIFU handle that? Well, SIFU obviously going for that martial arts angle where characters are, throwing very fast punches at each other, and a big focus is put on blocking and parrying. And in doing this, SIFU gets some things really well, like for example the tactile feel. The strength of the punches is very palpable while you're playing. It feels really good to just kick someone's ass, in other words. What the game doesn't do so well is variety or also complexity. I feel like for all the moves this game has, or all the options in combat you have, it seems that the backwards dodge and the back and forwards attack, which breaks defenses, are the biggest, most useful techniques in this game, which is not particularly a bad thing, but it does end up, I think, incentivizing the player into taking a less creative and less interesting route to the gameplay by, making these plays a lot more consistent than anything else. And in a game like this, where dying has some gameplay implications as well, sticking to the safe side might be what most players do, and probably should do given the incentive. And in that, it also ends up creating a sense of repetitious gameplay, which is also made worse by the fact that this game has a lot of roguelike features, but not in a way that I think are very satisfying. Basically, when you die in this game, you don't actually die. Instead, you grow 1 year older. What this means for the gameplay is you get stronger, but you also get weaker. What I mean by that is your attack grows stronger, but your health becomes lower. Which makes sense, of course. As you grow older, you become more proficient in your skills, but also you're older and you're more frail and fragile, which is a cool idea. My problem with the aging mechanic is more the fact that it doesn't really make sense within the story, but I'll get into that in a bit. Now, continuing with this mechanic though, when you die, you don't really die, like I said, you age and you keep playing from wherever you are. And so instead you only die when you reach your max age, which is around 70, and in that case then you have to restart the level at whatever age you started that level at. So in that way there is quite a lot of incentive to go back and replay levels to try and finish them with a lower age, so you have more age in the next level itself. There's gonna be a lot of talks about this game and its difficulty, but honestly I didn't find it horribly hard because of, again, the ability to just kind of abuse those dodge mechanics. And even though sometimes characters have a tendency of ganging up on you, you can also spam the block button to pretty much parry anything except heavy attacks, which once again just do the other one. Bosses is where I do think this changes a bit. Bosses can be quite challenging, especially the ones focusing more on ranged attacks. There's only 5 bosses in the game though, which does kind of feel like a wasted opportunity, where I do think this game should have focused more on bosses, purely because they are a lot more unique to fight over the very repetitive regular enemies, where you mostly get, regular enemy, big enemy, and enemy with weapon. I do think that a lot of the difficulty of this game also does come purely from the bad tutorial. I do think the game does not do a good job of teaching you its mechanics, mostly only teaching you that one dodge mechanic that I said is overpowered, and that breaking defense mechanic that also kind of fixes most things in this game, which, to be fair, are the more important moves to learn, but also it makes everything else seem even more useless. It also doesn't really help that the beginning of the game is very easy, and then there's a noticeable difficulty spike once you start the game for real, meaning that maybe the moves you were pulling in that first opening scene really just won't work later on, which I think gives the wrong idea of what the game should feel like, and may lead to people think it's harder than it actually is. Now moving on to the story, I'll be honest, it's quite weak. It's a revenge story and there's not much going for it. Don't really get a lot of development outside of the opening scene. Honestly, it just wasn't enough for me, to the point where when I went to fight each boss fight, I barely remember them from the opening. I was like, oh, is that supposed to be that one? Okay. Cool. I guess I'll beat you up. There's just not much going for it, and I do feel like the game acts like there is, especially since you mostly understand the story through the main character's perspective, which is purely of revenge, and also that most of this story is told through optional collectibles found throughout the game that add to this bigger picture, but honestly, I was just not that interested in that bigger picture. I do not think it's particularly told in an interesting way. And then when characters try to act like it is, it does also kind of diminish it for me. During boss fights, when characters are just throwing lines at you, I was just like, I don't care. It doesn't matter. The game does have a true ending though, which, it's very similar to other things you see in other revenge stories. Let's just say that if you didn't like the ending of The Last of Us 2, you probably won't like the true ending of this game. Now, going more into the gameplay, the other features outside of the combat, they talked about the aging, but now I want to talk about something else that is slightly related, which is the skills and moves that you can unlock. When you die, or in your base, or at a checkpoint thingy that allows you to upgrade, you can buy new moves, but only temporarily at first, meaning that once you finish a run, they'll get reset, or if you restart a level, the ones you've unlocked during that level will not save. Instead, then you can pay 5 times the price of a upgrade to unlock it for good, which is a lot, especially when I really don't think most people will be playing this game more than 2 times. They might play each level more than 2 times, but overall runs that would necessitate this feature, I just don't see why you would do it, unless you're going for 100% of course, but honestly, I don't think you should, especially when most of these upgrades are things like make weapons more durable, which, who cares? There's also another set of upgrades which always reset each run and can only be upgraded at certain specific spots during the level, and these, depending on how well or bad you're doing, allow you to build your character in different ways for that run, but honestly, once again, it's mostly things that don't matter all that much, or ones are just simply way overpowered compared to others. For example, one of them is recovering health after defeating an enemy, and another one is slightly raising your structure reserve, which you might not even notice, to be honest. And in that case, of course, the healing one is insanely more powerful, at least in my opinion. Also, I haven't mentioned what the structure reserve is, but it's basically what stops you from simply mashing the parry button to parry everything. Since, parrying still makes your structure bar go up, and if it goes up too much, it will break your structure basically, opening you up for attacks. But regardless, overall, I really do think that these roguelike elements are very at odds with the rest of the gameplay. It really doesn't feel like it deserves multiple playthroughs with the type of content that it's providing. Playing it twice, and even with the ability to skip a lot of things during the second playthrough, which is honestly a great addition, to be fair. Basically, the way it works is when you go to do the second playthrough, you already have the items from the first playthrough, so you can just skip scenes where, there would be a locked door and you'd have to go and get the key for it. Which also seems to disincentivize this roguelike element, since, doing that avoids quite a lot of combat. So my overall opinion on the gameplay is, it seems cool, but it is very rough around the edges. It also doesn't help that at the moment there are quite a lot of bugs that are not game breaking, but quite distracting. A lot of clipping between objects and some not so great animations. For example, often during fights, you'll just see arms clipping through other arms, or for example, when you're carrying a weapon, the weapon will just disappear when you're doing an animation, like for example, jumping over a table or climbing something, which just gives a very unpolished and kind of unfinished look to the game. One of the worst examples of this is during the third boss fight, but I'm not gonna spoil what it is. I'm just saying if you pick up that weapon, you're gonna notice it really does not feel like it was finished. Now let's talk about something that I really liked, but I also think there's quite a lot of problems with, and that is the graphics of this game. I already talked about some of the more visual issues with it, with the clipping and all that, but there are some other problems. I do think that the character design is not quite there. I think it does suffer from the problem of it would look better if I only looked at it from certain angles. I do think this game having a free camera can be kind of detrimental to the character design, since it is so heavily cel shaded and there's almost like a 2D effect to it. That being said, I do think that only applies to the characters of this game. The scenarios themselves are honestly incredible looking, which also ends up making me really sad because there aren't more than 5 levels in this game, which means, you know, probably a lot more time was put into each one of these levels, making it look so unique, but also, you know, I wish there was more. Things like very detailed locations where it also ends up affecting the gameplay, as a lot of it does end up being interactable during the fight, even though it can feel somewhat clunky at times to interact with. But regardless, I do think it looks great. There's a big contrast between the more greedy and cluttered streets and then the more clean and somewhat empty open areas of the big corporate buildings and martial art dojos. And adding to that, the way the game plays with lighting and some effects, weather effects and not so weather effects. I don't want to spoil, but let's just say there's some more fantastical visuals in this game that, you know, don't really conform to reality, which I also think fits the cel shaded aesthetic very well. Adding to that visual experience is also the soundtrack of the game, or the sound of the game in general. It is very bass heavy and there is quite a punch to it, which I do think fits this kind of martial arts theme, and it also kind of enhances the gameplay by making it, you know, just feel a lot heavier and stronger in a lot of ways. Also, simply the way it's incorporated feels very clever. Like, for example, in the nightclub level, you'll listen to a very nightclub style music, of course, while you're in the stage or in the main room. But then when you're in the backstages, you're still listening to it, but in a more muffled way. And that's the type of detail that I really appreciate in a game like this. And it's honestly just generally really good from this standpoint. So it is a shame that it is so rough around the edges. And that's kind of my opinion on the whole game. There is a lot of cool things here. It is at times very enjoyable and most of the time very nice to look at. But then it's also very repetitive. It feels like the rogue elements of the game really don't fit it well, and while the game is often beautiful, it also has a lot of little small problems that do kind of ruin what would otherwise be incredible art. And for those reasons, I am giving SIFU a 7 out of 10. It is still a good game, and it's still a game that I would recommend if you are into these kind of close combat, somewhat higher difficulty games. The thing I would advice though is maybe waiting for this game to get some patches. I do think quite a lot of it could be fixed through patches. I do think that the repetitive nature of the game probably can't though, but also I can easily recommend you to simply either play the game only once or play it only twice to get the true ending, and look up how to get the true ending because it's really not incredibly obvious how to do it. It is a bit unintuitive with the way gameplay works and how you finish off characters. That's all I'm gonna say without spoiling. Now, the people who I would not recommend this game to is people who'd be interested in for the story. I do think it's legitimately the weakest bit of the game. It is very simple and it doesn't have anything particularly going for it that I thought was captivating or just good. There's not a whole lot of storytelling here, and the game has a tendency of acting like there is, which I do think, again, makes it worse by doing that. Regardless of whatever your decision is though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing, liking and commenting, and nowadays also disliking, since YouTube really doesn't care. But regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and hopefully they make a Jackie Chan Adventures game next. Goodbye.